All right, well, good morning, and thank you for attending. I hope you're as eager as I am to learn more about other transaction agreements or other transaction authority, oftentimes as they're called, with Bob Toohey of ATI and Craig Marino of Squadron Defense. I've had a chance to learn a lot from both of them as we've been talking over the past several weeks in preparation for this. So just a quick note, this webinar is providing ideas and resources, but not specific guidance or recommendations for you and your unique business situation. So the speakers, in my experience, are more than happy to engage with you and your company individually, part of your advising team, talking with your senior execs, and they can work with you to develop, tailored recommendations based upon their expertise in your unique business situation in an offline fashion. So let's get moving. We have about an hour. I am recording this webinar, and for those of you that would miss this, you'll be able to review it again or share it with a friend. There'll be a link in the post-webinar email. It's just either found on my LinkedIn page or on my YouTube page, which then links out to LinkedIn or cross-linked. If you have a question, please use the Q&A feature for those, and they'll be answered either as it makes sense in the course of the presentation, or they'll be held until the end. So let's kind of jump right in. I'll give you a quick introduction on who I am as the host. I'm going to do a quick screen share. So my name is Brian Klickner. I'm with Risk Strategies. At a high level, we do employee benefits. You would think from kind of maybe your company's perspective, kind of the most related way to think about us is you have a fringe expense, and we help manage the employee benefit side of that, the health insurance, dental, vision, those types of expenses, which you're in the services business, tend to be like the second, maybe third largest line item of business expenses. So we help manage those in different ways. Risk Strategies, whether you know us or not, we're a large privately held insurance brokerage. We have over 75 offices and 1,800 employees. I'd like to say we have like 1,800 offices right now, considering the whole COVID thing. We primarily focus. I primarily focus on employee benefits, but we have substantial property and casualty, retirement, and personal lines expertise. At a high level, I'll just kind of run through, I won't go into detail on these case studies, but kind of how we differentiate ourselves, whether you're a small government contractor. Here's an example of a 50-employee government contractor in the DC metro area. I was able to earn their business after kind of talking through our different approach. After earning their business, we were able to save 50% on their ancillary benefits. You think of ancillary as dental, vision, life, disability, voluntary. Typically, when I talk to people, they've been with their prior agent for a number of years. This simply, I would love to say this was innovative to find this, but really what it was taking them to market and evaluating if what they had was meeting their needs and if the price point was correct. And unfortunately, the benefit was okay, but the price was exorbitant. And we're implementing some different strategies on the health insurance side, where we're targeting a 10% savings in year one of what we are developing as a 5-year strategy to move them from a fixed cost healthcare model to a variable cost healthcare model. Another similar example, this is a 100-person DC metro government contractor. We did the same thing on the ancillary side. Fortunately for them, it wasn't as bad, but we did find $8,000 of savings immediately. And we're in the process of going through an evaluation and working towards a target of 15% savings on healthcare on year one of the 5-year strategy for them as well. We work with clients, whether they're under 50, 100 employees. I think our largest client right now is about 4,000 employees. And whether it's 8K or 24K or $1 million in savings, depending upon the size of the business, they have substantial effects and impacts on what your business is able to do and how you can utilize those funds when they're not spent on benefits that aren't providing value to the organization or to the employees. So let me stop this share real quick. And I just lost where did that run off? So here we go, stop share. So with that, moving forward, so I'd like to introduce Mr. Craig Marino. My friend Craig is a COO of Squadron Defense Group, with responsibility for sales, marketing, service delivery functions for that company. He has senior level experience in a variety of sales, finance, and operations positions, including more than a decade as a trusted advisor on technology merger and acquisition transactions, and as a senior customer service official for the New York Mets. He is a graduate of Duke University School of Engineering and Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management for his MBA. Where he works, Squadron Defense Group, or SDG, provides commercial clients, government contractors, and defense and intelligence, defense and intelligence community agencies with a comprehensive range of professional services and products designed to enhance national security. SDG security consultants support clients' facility security officers with the operation and maintenance of their organization's facility clearances and personnel clearances, and provide guidance on topics such as insider threat programs, FOCI mitigation and export controls. SDG's manufacturing division produces mobile and modular sensitive compartmented information facilities, or SCIFs, and consulting to support the construction of secure space for classified communications. With that, I'll pass it over to Craig so he can begin our discussion with Bob of ATI.
Thanks, Brian. First off, really appreciate the opportunity to participate in this webinar. I think it's a really exciting topic and one that I think is really ripe to provide tangible benefits to companies. I'm always amazed at how many people have been in the industry for decades and still are not familiar with OTAs and the power that they represent for business development. So as I thought about who we could bring on, I've had the opportunity of working with ATI in the past on a couple projects, and they were a natural. So we reached out and really delighted that Bob can join us. Bob is the former Chief Operating Officer of ATI, and prior to that, he was the Senior Vice President for ATI's parent company, Answer. He served as the Deputy Director of Answer's Homeland Security Group, supervising a team of analysts that focused on research and development for DHS, which was a natural fit given that Bob had done prior work as an early consultant to the newly formed DHS when that department was stood up initially while he was at Hicks and Associates. And prior to that, he had a 27-year career working with the Defense Department as an SES, a Director of Science and Technology Plans and Programs. So as I said, he's a natural person to lead this discussion. He's got a wealth of experience that's relevant specifically to OTAs, but more broadly to the concepts of research and development for defense and intelligence community agencies. So with that, Bob, welcome. And if you would maybe give us a little background on ATI and the role that you folks play before we dive into the meat of the presentation.
Great, I'd be delighted. And thanks a lot, Craig. I do want to note on listening to your bio that it was too bad you couldn't find any good schools to go to for higher education. Anyways, I'm deeply thankful for you guys have asked us to come talk about it. ATI, which is Advanced Technology International, was the first company established over 20 years ago to manage consortia, to manage collaborations, which is what we do. We are a public service nonprofit corporation based in right outside of Charleston, South Carolina, a town called Somerville. We have about almost 260 people, most of them based right there in Somerville. And as you mentioned before, we are sort of the industry leader in managing other transaction-based consortia. But I do want to note, and I'll show you a couple of pictures later, we also manage several FAR-based consortia. So we understand both sides of the house, and it helps us actually bring a lot of value, I think, to our customers. So what I'll do is I will see if I can manage the technology here and see if I can share my screen, and I'll go through a little bit of a briefing on kind of what OTAs are, and then focusing mainly on the consortia process, because I think that would be of most interest to the folks here. And again, as I mentioned before, this is informal and flexible, so if you have anything, stop me and we'll talk about it. All right.
Bob, can you maybe give a little bit of the history, how OTAs came into being in the first place?
I will do that. Hold on a second while I bring in the screen here. Share. Did that come up? Let's see if it comes up full screen. There we go. How's that look?
Excellent.
All right. So it's very interesting. People think OTs are new because it's sort of the explosion of OTs is fairly recent, but they actually go back to the beginnings of NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. When in 1958 the Soviets launched Sputnik, it basically scared the hell out of everybody in the West, because if you can purposely put something in orbit like a Sputnik, then it's not a big jump to putting weapons in space and things like that. And that's the ultimate high ground, if you will, militarily. And so frankly, out of a great deal of concern and fear, the nation established the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. And along with that was an authorization for NASA that included the ability for them to enter into agreements, contracts, which they called Space Act agreements, and be exempt from the current acquisition regulations, which back then even were sort of onerous. Now they're obviously a lot worse. Unfortunately, the FAR tends to be, they tend to add to the FAR every time there's a little bit of a scandal, and so it grows over time, and that's why it's become so complex. And they use the term in the Space Act, other transactions as necessary, and that's where the term OTA comes from originally. So, so these things go back a long ways, primarily at the beginning of the space program.
I find it amazing that they've been around that long and so few people, or maybe rephrase that, so many people are unfamiliar with them. What do you think? What would you attribute that to?
Well, I think for a long time it was the only organization that had the authority was NASA. And in that vision back then, they really wanted to get at, for the space program, which was so different in a lot of ways from the national security or the medical R&D, which was the two main things that the federal government invested in at the time, that they thought they really needed to access a cohort of R&D developers that were not the typical government contractors. Back then, of course, we were living in the days of Eisenhower's famous military-industrial complex, which was kind of this ironclad thing that was hard to get a hold of. But I think the reason it took a long time for OTAs to sort of spread was because of the fact that it really was only NASA that had the authority for a long time. And if you'll look at this timeline that I've just put up, you can see from 1958 to 1972, basically, before other agencies started really getting any authority. And of course, I mentioned earlier that the primary investments on the part of the federal government back then were either national security or health, healthcare, medical, and that sort of thing. Because back in the days of Vannevar Bush, he said that's what the government should be investing in: quality of life and safety. And then you can see on this timeline that starting in 1989, DARPA got a hold of it, of the authority, along with the Department of Defense about the same time. And in fact, that's where I actually got my first experience with other transactions, because there was a program that the Clinton administration established called the Technology Reinvestment Program, and it was an attempt to come through on a campaign promise that said they were going to move a bunch of military R&D money to civilian purposes. Well, once Bill Clinton got in office, he realized that Congress was not really willing to let him move a lot of money out of DoD. And so they established a program where DoD would look for opportunities to do what it then became called dual use technology development, which is, if I have something I can develop for the military, but it also has a commercial use and market, maybe I can team in a public-private partnership with an industrial firm, a commercial firm, to get this done less expensively for the government, but also benefit the private sector and the citizenry, if you will, with some new technology that benefits the quality of life for the nation as a whole. An example of that is automatic braking systems, ABS. We contracted at DARPA at the time to significantly reduce the size of the automatic braking systems, which at the time were about the size, a little bit bigger than, say, a loaf of bread, the actual controllers, which was just too big for automobile companies to put on cars, because you know real estate is very special in cars, you know, and for that matter in military vehicles too. And so there's a public-private partnership put together under what I will show you later is U.S. Code 2371, where the commercial firm could come in. They had to put some money in the game also, work with the government, keep their intellectual property, and then be able to produce this in a commercial way. And that's basically what the explosion of automatic braking systems, which was both a safety feature and a marketing feature for cars and vehicles at the time. And that was kind of sort of the cohort of first projects that DARPA issued under that technology reinvestment program, which really started getting the Defense Department into the OT world. And you can see through this timeline that it spread to FAA and to Department of Transportation. Even before the Department of Homeland Security got established, the TSA was given authority, and they were given the only unrestricted authority, whereas most of the other organizations, it has to be sort of R&D prototyping kind of work. TSA can use an OTA for anything, and they do. The way they reimburse cities and for providing law enforcement support to the TSA gates and things like that, all that stuff, the way there's about 5 airports that actually have contracted TSA screening, all that's done through other transactions. And again, go ahead.
Let's say about, so what exactly is an OTA? What does it represent?
Let's talk about that. So an OTA is a legally binding contract. That's one thing that I think is an urban legend I'd like to dispel right here. People say, well, they're not contracts. They are. The only reason they don't call them contracts is just to draw a distinction between the federal acquisition regulation style contract and OTAs. But OTAs are legally binding contracts. They have the same strength and enforcement capability as any other contract between two organizations. You know, the two authorities that allow, in this case, the Department of Defense. I'm going to focus on DoD just because it's the largest user by far. The first one was U.S. Code 2371, which allowed for other transactions to do basic, applied, and advanced research projects. The 2371 has one very interesting requirement, and that is that it requires a cost share on the part of the providers. And back at the beginning of ATI, the very first OT consortia that was established was under 2371, and it's the National Ship Research Program, which the 8 shipyards that build ships for the government got together. And what they do is work on common problems that help reduce the cost of building ships for everyone, like stormwater management and new ways of welding and things like that. It's sort of pre-competitive stuff. And so, but they all have to kick in 1/3 of the cost of the projects under 2371. 2371B is the newer authority, and it goes after what's called prototyping projects, which I'll define here in a minute. And it allows for follow-on production, which 2371 does not. Which is a big deal, and that's very recent too. In fact, it's barely been used yet, but I see a big future there. The big difference between 2371 and 2371B to the commercial world would be that there's no requirement for cost share in 2371B, provided you have what's called a non-traditional R&D provider on the team that's doing the work.
So what are some of the things that help distinguish OTAs from more typical procurement vehicles?
Well, it's easiest just to talk about what an OTA is not. So an OTA is not a federal acquisition regulation contract. So it is actually exempt from federal acquisition regulations. In fact, it's exempt from a number of laws that directly relate to federal acquisitions, such as the Competition and Contracting Act and things like that. Doesn't mean that they don't do competitions. In fact, it's a very big part of it. They just don't have to follow the very strict requirements that the FAR has issued in response to SECA in that case. It's not really for development of production quantities, although there is this new authority that allows you to move into production if you want. It's not really for services as such, unless they are services you need in order to get to a prototype, which I'll talk about in a minute. And again, like I said, it's not constrained by the kind of previous government contracting practices and conventions. It is not subject to a protest award at the project level. Let me make a distinction here. The only protest that you can bring in an OTA is whether an OTA was appropriate at all. You can't protest who the winner is, for instance, which is what about 80–90% of the protests under the FAR are about who won. You know, jilted contractors being the ones bringing most of the protests. Once it's been determined that it was appropriate under 2371 or 2371B to have done an OTA, then it's no longer protestable. And that's a big deal, because protests have turned out to be a real large part of the cost, the opportunity cost especially, of contracting in the government, especially in increasing the timelines. And frankly, increasing the how can I put this? The fastidiousness with which contracts are awarded, or are requested, evaluated, and awarded. And probably the biggest way of attracting non-traditionals to this process is that you're not subject to mandatory cost accounting standards, which, if you've ever had to do that, is a huge, costly process that doesn't allow you to use normal commercial accounting systems. You actually have to implement another accounting system to comply with federal contract cost accounting standards, and the people along with it. Back in the late 90s, when I was in DoD, we did a study, and it turned out that for most of the major acquisition programs, the cost of the additional cost accounting standards was as much as a 20% premium on the cost of acquisitions. Now you think about billions and billions of dollars, 20% is serious money. But mostly it scares away small businesses that just don't want to be involved with government work.
So it's not hard to understand, looking at that list, Bob, why OTAs have appeal. How has that appeal been reflected in their use?
Well, if you look at in the case of OTA collaborations, which is this consortia model, if you go back to 1998, which was the beginning of that Navy ship research and development program I was talking about, it started at about $5 million when one consortia, and in 2019 it got up to nearly $5 billion. All the numbers on 2019 aren't in yet, but you can see this incredible kind of hockey stick increase in dollars, and it seems to be accelerating. And when I get to the end of this, I hope to provide some exciting insight into that too.
Bob, what do you attribute that sudden surge that starts around 2011, 2012? Is that the introduction of more agencies into the OTA family?
I think it is. Plus, there was the establishment of this of the largest of the consortia in DoD, called the National Armaments Consortia, which is by far the largest of all the consortia and the busiest. It is everything that you want to do with armaments, and anything basically in the kill chain can be done through that consortia, and it literally is up into the billions of dollars right now just for that one consortia. And then once you started seeing these examples where, I mean, I've got a ton of stories and I won't bore you with, but some of them are kind of exciting, about being able to get from an identified requirement in Afghanistan for a higher, more precision and higher velocity mortar round, because of of working in the mountains and stuff like that in Afghanistan, to under contract in 90 days to delivering production rounds to Afghanistan in 18 months. When those stories started getting out, organizations that had these R&D portfolios, we're all kind of asking how to get in the business. But one other thing, and this was one of the teasers that Brian and I recorded the other day, is, we now realize that our adversaries, our potential adversaries, maybe they're not even adversaries yet, are all just accelerating their ability to refresh their own technology. And in the old Moore's law that says, you double the computing power in 18 months is actually getting smaller. I mean, it's a lot less than that. And you can apply that same speed to all technology, especially any technology that might be enabled by computers. And I think we finally started realizing that the only way to get inside that our adversaries' technology refresh cycle is to find some way to get around our own barriers and obstructions, which of course turn out to be the way we've been doing business traditionally, and to access this cohort of innovative R&D entrepreneurs who really don't need the government to put their businesses together, but this government certainly needs them.
So, given the nature of what we've been talking about, can you maybe dive a little deeper into the mechanics? How does an OTA work? What's sort of the process that takes us through that?
Sure. Let me I'm going to go through a couple of slides a little quickly, but I just want you to understand a couple of things. One is that 2371B, we talk about what is a prototype. Well, there's a couple of definitions of prototype. The law has some interesting things, but basically it's anything in all the R&D that leads up to proving that a capability can be had, proving that a technology can provide a capability. And it's not much more specific than that, although there are some examples in the law. But the idea is that you can stretch back, you can do contracts or agreements under 2370B that go all the way back to sort of applied technology, but as long as you can show that there's a path to a prototype. And that's really very, very exciting, because that gets you this sort of unbroken movement from understanding that phenomena might help to actually applying it to a problem. This is a quote from the DoD guide, which sort of defines what they consider to be a prototype project. And as you can see, it's pretty much anything that gets you to demonstrating a new capability. I will mention something that's kind of important here, and I think you'll see this is another area that will cause a dramatic increase in the use of OTs. There's a line here that says, including a business process. Now, there's nothing in the law that says that a particular appropriation is necessary for OTs. Now, in practical application, and a lot of generals counsel have sort of assumed that you had to be in R&D. But the addition of business processes says that no, if you want to do business process improvement, you can use OTs, and business process improvements are almost always appropriately funded out of operations and maintenance money. And so the law itself is appropriation agnostic. And the definition of what a prototype is infers a lot of different potential appropriations. And so I think we may see this spread beyond R&D, although by far the biggest use is going to be R&D. I mentioned earlier that the 2371B does not have a requirement for cost share under certain circumstances, and these are kind of the circumstances. You have to have at least one non-traditional defense contractor significantly participating, or you do have to have the 1/3 cost. Or, as in most laws, a senior procurement official can waive the requirement depending upon how important the project looks like it is to national security. But the most interesting thing from here, which happened just a couple years ago, is they added the ability to go directly on to follow-on production without further competition, provided that the original project was competitively awarded and that the prototype was successfully completed. You may have heard recently, a year or so ago, about a protest of a contract, the RAIN contract, the famous RAIN contract, the cloud contract, And the reason that it was successfully protested, and this goes back to what I said earlier about saying, whether it was appropriate for an OT or not. The original award was competitively awarded. However, the prototype was not successfully completed before they went ahead and went to the production contract. And so the department was ordered to go back and redo this so it was in compliance with the law. But they did not protest the fact that rain was the winner, which again is, and so now this has turned into a whole bigger ball of wax than what it was originally. But the bottom line is you can move on to production now without further competition if you competitively awarded the previous effort and that it was successfully completed.
I think this is what certainly gets me excited, and what I think is the big draw to OTAs, because getting an award to do a research project is rather, it's a project. And once that project's over, it's over. So there's a real clear cap on what the business can expect to achieve through that prototype award. But when they can then take that and spin it into a production award, now you're seeing a level of significance from a business perspective that makes it very appetizing for folks that might otherwise take a pass. So, Bob, there are two significant requirements that you mentioned up top. Can you define what non-traditional and significant participation actually means?
I can. So essentially what a non-traditional contractor is a contractor who previously either hasn't worked for the government or has not been required because of their work with the government to comply with this cost accounting standards and stuff like that. All nonprofits, so universities and things like that, count as non-traditional defense contractors. And this is something that I think is really, really exciting, because this brings in a ton of potential R&D providers and innovation that the government previously really did not have access to. Because, for instance, if you're building gaming technology and you have a really interesting new way of doing gaming technology, which might be a great enabler to something in the Department of Defense, the Department of Defense market is small compared to the commercial market for gaming. And so it doesn't even get people's interest, especially if they've got to jump through a bunch of hoops just to get to that kind of small additional market. This ability to go after non-traditional contractors and giving them incentives and low barriers of entry really, I think, has provided the government access to an innovative world that they didn't have before. I think right now there's about in the consortia, the 13 consortia that ATI manage, there are about 4,500 members, and I think we're at around 70% non-traditionals. Think about that. That's a tremendous number of organizations that the government previously might not have had access to. This idea of what counts as significant participation, everybody wants to use dollars as a metric because they're easy to measure. But dollars are not the metric for significant participation. It can be, it could be one of the metrics. But in the case of what counts as significant participation, it could be a lot of things. It could be a key technology, even though it's dollar-wise might be a small part of the overall project, or a novel application, an intellectual property that nobody else has access to. It could be something that gives a material increase to the performance. Any one of these things could count. Even a material reduction in cost or schedule. Those are big deals when it comes to a major project. In the end, what is significant is in the eye of the government. The government sponsors for the project get to choose whether they believe that it is significant enough. But I can tell you that we have had very, very little problem with that. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of projects, we may have only had one or two where we were questioned about whether there was enough significant enough performance by a non-traditional within a particular project. But again, it also incentivizes the large integrating contracting organizations to team, because they also get access to this new innovation that other organizations and that they may not have. and they don't have to worry about the cost share problem. If they're
I think that's a really important point, Bob. I think, for folks who are first being introduced to OTs, frequently they think it's just a bunch of small organizations that are new too, but there are, all of the large contractors are there, and they're there for the same reasons the government agencies are there: access to new technology, partnership opportunities, looking for technology they can integrate and leverage. So again, for businesses that are contemplating whether or not getting involved in an OT makes sense for them, I think this is another benefit that they can look to take advantage of. And on that point, OTs are awarded as individual exercises, but ATI helped pioneer this concept of consortiums and collaboration. And I know you want to provide a little bit more background into how that works, what the mechanics are of that, and why they're important.
I'd love to do that. So real quick, just to bring everybody to the same baseline, what is a consortium? Well, a consortium is, two or more companies that band together providing to work on a common problem, which is what these consortia tend to be. They kind of agree to participate with a common set of rules, how we're going to operate the competitions, how we're going to collaborate with each other, what it's going to cost, for instance, to be involved in the consortium. There are generally dues, very small dues, but there are dues, and those sorts of things. They tend to be focused on particular mission areas or technology areas, because it allows them to sort of focus their efforts in a particular area amongst a peer group that's also interested in that particular area. They generally hire a management organization, which is what ATI is. The example I like to use is, if you think about your homeowners association, the homeowners association is basically a consortium of owners who get together, and then they hire a management company to make sure that the trash is picked up and the snow is plowed and the entrances all look nice and pretty and things like that. And so essentially that's the role that ATI provides to these consortia. The consortia have their own boards that manage themselves. Now, that's not true with all consortia in the government. It is true of all ATI managed consortia. They have their own governance representative executive committee that manages the way that the consortium runs and chooses the amount of dues and stuff like that. And then ATI then does all the backroom stuff and the management and making sure the trains get on time. And I'll show you, we do a lot of training. A lot of these non-traditionals need help understanding what the government does, even though, there's a lot of stuff they're not going to have to do that traditionals had to do, but there's a lot of stuff, the way the government talks and operates, they still have some help with. So we provide training on that sort of thing, and security and cyber security and things like that as a administrative organization. But they're designed to minimize these barriers that I mentioned about to get these non-traditionals into the consortium. So how does this work? The government can either enter into an OTA for a single effort, which is basically what DIU does, the Defense Innovative Unit. They get a single problem, they go out, do some technology foraging, find a few companies that are in that business, then run a short competition, bring them on board, issue a single OT to get that project done. But if you're an organization that has a large portfolio of R&D needs and R&D requirements, then the consortium might be a better way to go. And what happens is the government issues a OTA to a CMF, a consortium management firm, which is what ATI is, to then create a consortium and then manage all the business between the government and the consortium. And I'll get into a little more detail about that later. The biggest thing it does for the government is create this channel to a group of industry and academia organizations that care about the same specific problems that the government cares about.
So who are the key players within the consortium environment?
So this is sort of a typical, now a lot of people will say if you've seen one consortium, you've seen one consortium. They do They're all unique in their own ways, but sort of a typical construct would be you'd have these two groups of organizations. You have a government alliance because once these OTs consortium are established, they start drawing sponsors, customers, if you will, because of the things that I'll be telling you about in a little while. So for instance, that largest one I mentioned, the National Armaments Consortium, has 75 sponsors from all over the government. And so they usually put together their own little organization to collaborate amongst themselves on how to do this sort of thing. Then you have the consortium putting it together, and in this particular picture, we tried to color code this to be, you know, large, small, nonprofit, academia, with their representative board that manages the consortia. And basically, usually it's the same demographics. The participation on that board is roughly the same demographics. So if you have, you know, 70% of the consortia is non-traditionals, then usually 70% of the executive board is also non-traditionals. So they're fairly represented. And then of course you have the consortium manager, us, who are kind of doing the administrative work of the consortium. And all this, like I said, the bridge between the two is this other transaction agreement, which is so flexible that the government can kind of design it in a way that helps it the most. I'm gonna talk about this a lot, but this is just one chart that kind of shows, you know, what the benefits of these collaboration models are. I already mentioned access. Industry has access to the government, and I'll show you later the collaboration is very important because there's a lot more free exchange of information under an OTA than there is allowed under the application of the FAR. But the government gets this access to this broader spectrum of technology providers. Again, information moves smoothly between industry and the government in a lot easier fashion than it does under traditional means. Small companies can get involved. You know, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but it's important, by the way, that the large integrators are involved in this because they know about integrating technology into these major systems that are out there. And so these companies can get involved in these consortium and get access to organizations that if they picked up the phone and tried to call the head of R&D for Raytheon, might have a hard time getting through. These collaborations, you know, enable that and actually facilitate and force those conversations, which is kind of fun. And of course, speed. One of our favorite sayings is that they come for speed, but they stay for the collaboration when they realize how important it is. And those are not unconnected. The collaboration that happens, especially early on in the process, leads to speed. But the speed that's capable under OTAs can be eye-watering if you've spent a lot of time in the traditional government world. And this is what I meant to, what I was talking about earlier. The CMF, the consortium management firm, gives the government a single point of entry to get to these hundreds of organizations. I mean, they pick up the phone, they have one number to call, one belly button to push. Somebody at ATI answers it and says, "Yes, sir, we'll take care of this." And then we manage the needs of the government with the consortia. And as I said, consortia average between 60 and 65. I actually think this is an old chart. I think we're now more around 70 to 75%. And for all the reasons I mentioned earlier, you get a lot of benefit to the government. Not the least is that the enterprise learning curve is very, very short.
Yeah, Bob, that concept of single entry point, I think, is huge, particularly for small businesses that are not historically in this realm. Just sifting through all the various procurement databases to understand where the opportunities sit. If you can find an OTA consortium that is specific to your technology expertise, to be able to go just there and have the full range of opportunities that are relevant to you, I think is really powerful and very efficient for everybody involved.
Well, I have to tell you, you know, I've been in R&D for 45 years, and it is definitely the most exciting model that I've seen in all those years for getting things done quickly and easily, and getting at new technology faster. And look, let's face it, faster is cheaper. you know, because time takes money, you know, costs money for time. And so I think this is important. And that's where I talk about it's better, faster, and smarter access to innovation. And I'll get a little bit more of what I think. We do have robust competition. You can't, you know, you have hundreds and hundreds of contractors in each one of these consortium. The largest one I think is about almost 900 contractors. And then you'll see the give and take gets you to all the goodness that makes things better, faster, and smarter. So I'm going to dwell for a second on this chart. This sort of is the process chart, if you will, of how this stuff works. And I'm gonna focus on a couple of parts that I think are extremely important. So this is after the government has come to an organization like ATI and said, build us a consortium for, you know, let's say armaments technology, and we go out and we start recruiting companies. A lot of the companies, you know, have been waiting for this. The government has already announced pretty broadly they're going to create this consortium. Even during the proposal process where we are responding to an RFP to build a consortium, we are getting letters of intent from organizations to start. And we usually on day one, we'll have a couple of hundred organizations that have already committed to joining the consortia. But let's say now we've got the consortia established and we're ready to go. The government now is ready to start talking to us about problems. But they don't really know how to characterize the problem. You know, I ask when I do speeches, or used to do speeches before we got the COVID lockdown, how many contractors out there have ever gotten an RFP that they had no idea what the government was asking for? And usually about 80% of the hands reach up in the audience, you know, and that's because I believe a lack of this kind of give and take that OTAs allow. So you come to the government comes out with a problem, and we hold these collaborative events with the membership and the government, and they're able to talk to back and forth as they're actually preparing the requirement. They get to ask the industry, what's the art of the possible, and government and the industry can ask the government, what did you really mean by that? You know, what are you really looking for? And they do sort of a curation of the problem, which becomes very powerful, because by the time the government is done with the requirement, the membership understands what the government's about to ask for. Now, we do this in a lot of different ways. We do it in one-off stuff. We do it in these really large consortia, like the National Armaments Consortia. We do it twice a year with a book, if you will, of requirements that come out. Sometimes there's, you know, 500 different requirements that come out in that book, and then we start socializing that requirement with with industry. You can see here RPPs is just our word for RFPs, because within the consortium they're called requests for project proposals. Generally, by the way, and the government puts requirements in. There's you know, things that they have to comply with. Nothing anywhere near like RFPs that are FAR RFPs. I mean, these RPPs tend to be a couple of pages, you know, and the requirements might be something like you need a top secret clearance and stuff like that. As soon as we put the RPP out, we start a bunch of collaborative work within the industry community. We do what we call speed networking, which is sort of a play on speed dating, and we do this now virtually because for two reasons. Number one, nowadays because of the problems with face-to-face meetings, but also because when you have face-to-face meetings, you're asking small companies to buy a airplane ticket and get to this meeting, which sometimes is a big business decision for some of these small businesses. And so we've got very, very robust infrastructure for doing virtual meetings. So we expose whoever wants to show what they can do at 10-minute intervals to the larger integrating contractors, and from that they can start deciding who they want to have. They may want to talk to about teaming up to solve a problem. We also, by the way, provide sort of a very robust members-only website, you know, web presence, if you will, where each member has a quad chart, a statement of capabilities, so that, you know, companies can kind of peruse that and figure out where their potential partners would be. At any rate, shortly after that, partners form, and those partners then submit project proposals. And proposals are usually very brief. They can be as short as 2 pages. They can be, none of them get much more than 10 or 11 to 15 pages. Sometimes they have cost in them. If the government doesn't care about cost in terms of evaluating the projects, they don't even require a cost proposal. But whatever the government asks for, these proposals come in back to the consortium management firm. Of course, the consortium management firm then checks those proposals for compliance to the extent that there is a compliance required, such as, did they say whether they had clearances or not? Did they speak to each one of the sub-requirements within the requirements document? Just to make sure that when it goes to the government, it goes is exactly what the government needs to make its evaluation. Now, here's the part that I think a lot of organizations will be excited about. If your proposal comes in and it's not compliant, you're not immediately disqualified like you are in kind of FAR-based competitions. We pick up the phone and we call you and say, hey, you didn't do this, you need to do that. You got 48 hours to fix it and get back to us so that we can get it to the government. And nobody gets disqualified because of a technical failure of, a technicality, if you will, on their proposals. Some of them can't be compliant and they say, okay, well, we didn't understand that, so we're not gonna propose, but that's very, very rare. So we package these proposals, these compliant proposals up, and sometimes, by the way, we have to surge our entire company to get this compliance check done. I will tell you that the National Armaments Consortium will frequently have 1,200 white papers provided in one of these cycles, and we bring everybody together in the company who are all cross-trained to do the compliance, and within 48 hours we generally have this package ready for the government. Then the government does the technical evaluation. Sometimes they do the cost evaluation. Sometimes we do the cost reasonableness, depending upon which government sponsor. They do things differently, but we have that available if we do it. The government then selects who they want to fund. They first deem that this is a project that is worthy of being funded. Then they figure out how much money they have and they decide which ones get funded. And then they ask ATI to then issue, they give us the money, they ask ATI to then issue essentially what are sub-OTAs to the teams and have them get off and start working. Our work doesn't stop then. We actually follow the projects and make sure that all the administrative requirements on the part of the government, the reporting that the government requires, all that stuff, the deliverables and all that stuff gets done also, all the way up to closing out the project.
Bob, that's a great summary of the mechanics of how this works. We've only got a few minutes left, so maybe we can move quickly through the last few slides. I think the open communication slide that you got next is really powerful in that it's atypical of government procurement, which tends to be very opaque. And I think there's benefit for everybody through that open communication.
I think you're right, and I've already talked about that a lot. And by the way, there's only a very short period when the government doesn't talk during that whole process. Even in their evaluation, they're allowed to talk and make sure. But they pay attention to good competitive ethics, so that if they think they've come across something that everybody should know, we certainly pump that out in these members-only websites. And by the way, one other thing about those RPPs, we also put them out on traditional things like what used to be Fed Biz Ops and things like that, and say basically, if you're interested in this, you need to join the consortium. We also go to places like Wired Magazine and do advertisements just to make sure we get to that group. I'll mention this flexibility. I'll try to get through this kind of quickly, but I mentioned earlier that they select a bunch of projects that look like they could be awarded, but they may not have enough money for all those projects. And so they do two things. They say which ones they can afford. We go off, work begins. And then the ones that they said were worthy of award but no money, we put in what's called a basket. It's an electronic basket. And for up to 2 years, those projects, those proposals sit in the basket. And if money becomes available, such as end of year money and things like that, government can go in and pull that project out and just award it. Gussy it up, make sure it's still current, but then award it. And that's turned out to be very, very important in these years where money arrives late in the government and it's hard to spend it by the end of the fiscal year. Almost 60% of the National Armaments Consortium's projects awarded last year came out of the basket. I mentioned speed. It is not a problem at all, and sometimes faster, although sometimes slower, for us to go from requirement announcement, that's the RPP, to work beginning within 90 days, which is just
That's
wonderful.
remarkable.
Yeah, it is. I mentioned a lot about what the CMF's role is. We work for both the government and for industry. We help manage the consortium, the administrative side of the consortium, the collection of dues, the provision of training, the cyber infrastructure that we provide them, especially small businesses that really can't afford maybe to have the ramp certified systems. We supply them and help them with that. The government generally, we do all the heavy lifting when it comes to the competition. The government does only basically the technical evaluation, and they drop the entire amount of money on us usually ahead of time so that we don't have any trouble with waiting for money to come through and then drop it to put on the individual contracts. This is a quick list of this kind of matches, if you will, the chart I showed earlier of the steep rise in dollars. This is the number of, we believe current, although this is a moving target, of consortia out there right now. The orange ones happen to be the ones that ATI manages. And again, I mentioned we just got RFPs for new ones that are going to be done. These are our collaborations that we manage right now. Under the blue umbrella here are all the OT ones, but I mentioned earlier we also do some FAR collaborations. They're not as easy to do, but but we do them also. And if you look across here, you've got space, you've got undersea technology, you've got aviation and missiles, armaments, information warfare, medical technologies. We're doing between MTech and the Medical Countermeasures Consortium, we're doing I mentioned earlier, a significant amount of COVID-19 research because we were there. It's in the scope of our consortium, and HHS has started using that to get under contract quickly to get some of that done. And of course, there's the new Naval Surface Technology Innovation Consortium, and one Homeland Security Consortium, which is the Border Security Technology Consortium. So here, I try to get done quickly. This is the thing that I think is exciting. This is the DoD R&D budget, and I'm just going to talk about that for now because it satisfies the point. Right now, the total use of OTAs through the DoD R&D budget is about 4% of the total, which is
what's that dollar value?
That's around $4 billion, maybe almost $5 billion. I think the current budget is $115 billion. If you very conservatively choose the categories of R&D that are best suited for OTAs and OTA collaborations, my estimate, this is Bob Toohey's estimate from being in this business for a long time, is that 30 or 40%, let's say 40% of that, $50 billion could be successfully managed through OTAs, both single OTAs and collaborations in the consortium business. So there's a significant area of growth here where we can really start accelerating the pace of technology development in DoD alone, much less the rest of the government, if we use the OTAs. So you can look at it from two ways. One is there's plenty of room for the government to expand its use of OTAs. And as an OTA person and companies that want to be involved in OTAs, this is the market opportunity. Potentially 40% of the DoD budget, $60 billion. $60 billion. And so the future can be very bright if we can expand the use of OTs.
So we are just about in an hour. I think we have a minute left. We do have time for questions. I'll ask Craig and Bob, do you have a few additional minutes for overtime if some questions?
I do.
Sure.
All right. Then we'll run into overtime. If you need to leave, I certainly understand. To ask a question, just type it into at the bottom of your screen. There should be a little Q&A. open that up and type the question. Yeah, I can certainly, if need be, if it's a very detailed question, we can promote somebody up. It looks like we have Catherine Taylor has her hand raised. So I will, let me just promote you to talk and you can ask. Catherine, are you there?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Basically, I wanted to go back to the auditing of an OTA. If I'm under an OTA with a prime contractor, they're not that familiar with OTAs, but we have been a prime on an OTA, and they've put a lot of DCAA language where we have a firm fixed price contract, and now they've put a lot of auditing structures. And we are not familiar with that because basically we had one as a phase one. And firm fixed price means we do the work and we present the work whether whether we've come under or we've come over. Can they impose on us those DCAA standards, which after it's done or you're getting close to the very final milestone payment, they can sit and audit all your work? And what can they ask of you if under an OTA? What kind of financial documents? Because you've presented that you've accomplished all your milestones and they've paid you up until the final payment. Is that permissible, or are they just throwing in some extra language there?
So did you say you were the prime?
We were a prime on a phase one. Now it's phase two, and the DoD insisted that we go with a lead system integrator.
Okay.
And in my particular contract, there's so much accounting language that they can send auditors to come through and go through all my books. And we are tiny, small, non-traditional. There's like 3 people working on this, and the accounting requirement almost looks like I have to hire another full-time person just to deliver the documents they wish, but they're not even defining what those documents are or what their a non-traditional audit might look like. They're not defining anything, and so I don't want to get us in deep kimchi if I cannot conform to that.
You have not signed that yet, you're saying. That's their proposal. Say again?
It's in the proposal, but the contract has started and we haven't signed our final bit. But we're definitely a prime portion of this contract. And it's making me nervous at my OTA.
Go ahead. To be honest, there's a phenomenon we call far light or far minus, where you have a continuum that's on one end is a blank piece of paper and the other end looks just like a FAR contract. And there's a lot of stuff in between, because there are a lot of government agreements officers out there that the farther you move away from the FAR, the more nervous they get. And so it sounds to me like the agreements officer, if this is an OTA, the phase 2 is an OTA, the agreements officer has started applying a bunch of FAR requirements on your prime, and they're just flowing those down to you all. That is absolutely anti-philosophical, if you will, for OTs. And unfortunately, the only thing you can do is if it's a flow down, in my opinion, the first thing I do is just go back to them and say, no, we're not going to do that. It's a fixed price contract. You can do anything you want that requires generally accepted accounting principles, GAAP principles. We don't mind being audited in that way, because companies shouldn't mind that. But these special government contracting requirements is exactly why we signed an OTA, was to get away from that. And they need to push back on their government sponsor about that, or they need to figure out how to comply without you having to give any that kind of detail. Now, I'm not giving you advice because I don't have the documents. I'm just telling you that typically the difference between FAR and OTA is the difference between a parent-child relationship with contractors and a team, a win-win team, where it's like, I know you may not want to, but in the end you can walk away from this, because the bottom line is that's not in keeping with what an OTA is supposed to be for. And so I would put the onus on the prime to either really see if they have to require that, or if they shouldn't they push back on the government to allow them to at least let their OTA subcontractors comply in the way that those non-traditionals are supposed to be able to comply. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, excellent question, Catherine. And Bob, thanks for for the answer. It looks like we're now 5 minutes late, and we have lost some of our attendees. So with that, Craig, I'll give you the last word, or if you have one last question that you want to kind of wrap through.
Yeah, the only question I have for Bob, I mean, I'm really enamored with the concept of OTAs. I think it's just an enormous opportunity that many folks are missing. So the one question I would have, Bob, is what are the requirements that a company that has not participated in OTA, what are the things that they need to be aware are likely to be required of them in order to join a consortium or just participate on an OTA opportunity?
So let me speak to the ones that ATI manages, which is, again, the majority of them, or at least over half of them. It depends on the consortium. Remember that executive board sets the rules. They're usually, they're biased toward reducing barriers to entry. So they're usually simple. The government may require, not in every case, but in most cases, the government may require that they're a US company, that they have a DD 2354 or 2345, whatever that is. Anyways, they may have other, kind of unique requirements to that particular domain that they're operating in. In all of ours, you are required to be an R&D provider. So in other words, some of the other consortium allow news companies to be involved just so they can get the information. In all of ours, those executive boards require you to be a provider so that you're actually in there for the right reasons, You have to pay dues generally, but there are a couple of consortiums that have gotten so much throughput that they suspend dues frequently, Other than that, that's pretty much it. There's, if you're an R&D provider, in most cases, if you're an American company, and you can come up with $500 dues, and usually they require that you participate in at least one collaborative event a year. Well, now that we're doing a lot of those, or most of them virtually, that's an easy lift also.
Sure. Excellent. Well, excellent. Thanks for the answer and great question, Bob. So, just real quick, kind of in summary, Craig and I are going to be hosting another panel here coming up in the next few weeks. So you may be interested. It's on the 22nd of September regarding cybersecurity maturity model certification, or the CMMC. So you'll get some additional information on that. With that, I'm gonna say thank you to all those that attended and your engagement, as well as Craig and Bob. I really appreciate your energy, enthusiasm, and expertise in this area. I learned a lot, and also having the opportunity to speak with you and leading up to this was fantastic. So, everyone have a great day, and with Bob and Craig in turn, I'll kind of let you each have last words.
Thank you very much for the great questions, Craig. This was a blast. Hopefully I didn't take up too much time, but as you can see, I'm kind of excited about it. But thank you, and thank you for everybody who listened in. I'm always happy to tell the story.
Bob, Brian, thanks a lot. Appreciate it. And thanks for everyone for tuning in.
Have a great day.